The year is 1815. The Treaty of Ghent has just been signed, ending the War of 1812. British soldiers are boarding ships in the Chesapeake Bay, sailing away from a smoking Washington, D.C. where they had burned the White House and the Capitol just months before. Standing on the deck of HMS Tunnet, watching the American coastline fade into the Atlantic mist. Admiral Alexander Cochrane must have felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and frustration. Britain had won nearly every major naval engagement. They had humiliated the Americans on their own soil, demonstrating the overwhelming superiority of British military power. And yet they were leaving. They were sailing home without reclaiming the colonies that had been torn away just 3 decades earlier. This is the great paradox of Anglo-American relations in the 19th century. Britain had the motive, the means, and multiple opportunities to reverse the verdict of 1776. The world's most powerful empire, the nation that would spend the next century painting a quarter of the globe pink, never seriously attempted to reconquer the United States. To understand why requires us to look beyond the mythology of American exceptionalism and British decline. The answer isn't found in any single battle or treaty.
This globe illustrates
It's found in the cold arithmetic of imperial economics, the shifting currents of global power, and a series of calculations made in the drawing rooms of Westminster that prioritize profit over pride. Let's start with the immediate aftermath of the American Revolution. When Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown in 1781, Britain didn't accept defeat because it had been militarily crushed. The British Army was still a formidable force. The Royal Navy still dominated the seas. What Britain had lost was the will to continue a war that had become ruinously expensive and strategically questionable. By 1783, when the Treaty of Paris formally recognized American independence, the British government had already begun to reframe the loss not as a catastrophe, but as an inconvenient adjustment to the balance sheet. The key insight came from the merchants and bankers in the City of London. They had done the mathematics. They had calculated the cost of maintaining a military occupation of a hostile, sprawling territory 3,000 miles across the ocean. They had counted the expense of garrisoning thousands of troops, suppressing constant rebellions, and fighting a guerrilla war in the American wilderness. And then they had compared those costs to the alternative. What if Britain simply traded with the Americans instead of ruling them? What if they sold manufactured goods to these former colonists who still spoke English, still admired British culture, and still needed British credit to build their new nation? The numbers were startling. Within a decade of independence, British exports to the United States had not only recovered but exceeded the levels from before the war. American merchants were buying British textiles, British tools, British luxury goods. They were borrowing money from British banks to finance their westward expansion. The Americans were consuming British products without Britain having to pay for their defense, their administration, or their infrastructure. It was colonialism without the overhead. It was economic control without political responsibility. This realization transformed British strategic thinking. The question was no longer how to reconquer America, the question was how to maintain profitable access to American markets while letting someone else pay for the privilege of governing the place. This is why when tensions flared again in the lead-up to the War of 1812, the British response was measured and calculated. They weren't fighting to reclaim the colonies. They were fighting to protect their maritime rights and punish American arrogance. But reconquest was never the objective. The War of 1812 itself demonstrated this perfectly. Britain had just finished defeating Napoleon at Waterloo. The Duke of Wellington, the greatest general of the age, was available. Britain had battle-hardened troops, vast naval superiority, and the military capacity to launch a full-scale invasion of the American coast. And what did they do? They burned Washington as a symbolic humiliation. They raided the Chesapeake. They blockaded American ports. But they never committed the forces necessary to occupy and hold American territory because the cost-benefit analysis didn't support it. Wellington himself was asked to take command of British forces in America. He declined. He looked at the geography, looked at the logistics, and concluded that even if Britain could defeat American armies in the field, occupying the United States would require an army of 100,000 men stationed indefinitely thousands of miles from home, fighting a population that would resist every step of the way. It would be a bleeding wound on the empire's finances and manpower for what? To rule over a hostile population that was already buying British goods anyway. The Treaty of Ghent in 1814 essentially reset relations to the status quo before the war. No territory changed hands. No reparations were paid. It was a draw on paper, but in reality, it was a British strategic victory. They had demonstrated their military dominance, bloodied the Americans' nose, and then walked away, secure in the knowledge that the economic relationship would continue. The Americans would keep buying British manufactured goods. British investors would keep financing American infrastructure. The informal empire would function without the costs of formal control. But there were moments, flashpoints in the decades that followed, when war between Britain and America seemed not just possible, but likely. In each case, cooler heads prevailed not because of sentiment, but because of money. The Oregon Crisis of 1844 to 1846 is instructive. Both Britain and America claimed the Oregon Territory, a vast expanse of land in the Pacific Northwest. American expansionists chanted 5,440 or fight demanding the entire territory up to the Alaskan border. British interests, particularly the Hudson's Bay Company, wanted to protect their fur trade monopoly. The situation escalated. War looked imminent. But again, the ledgers were consulted. British industrialists calculated the value of the Oregon fur trade against the value of Anglo-American commerce. The fur trade was worth millions. The trade with the eastern United States was worth tens of millions. A war would disrupt trade, devastate British textile exports, and potentially push America into the arms of Britain's European rivals. The decision was made in the boardrooms, not the war rooms. The Oregon Treaty of 1846 split the territory along the 49th parallel. Britain got Vancouver Island and its Pacific ports. America got the rest. Both sides walked away with something. Trade continued uninterrupted. The same calculation played out during the American Civil War, perhaps the most dangerous moment in Anglo-American relations. The Confederacy courted British recognition and support, hoping that Britain's dependence on southern cotton would force London to intervene on their behalf. And for a time, it seemed plausible. The British textile industry was suffering from the cotton shortage. There was genuine sympathy in parts of the British aristocracy for the southern cause. British shipyards were building commerce raiders for the Confederacy. The Trent Affair of 1861, when a U.S. Navy ship stopped a British vessel and seized Confederate diplomats, nearly triggered war. But once again, economic interests overrode political impulses. British bankers held enormous quantities of Union bonds. British industrialists had diversified their cotton supply, importing from Egypt and India. And crucially, the British working class, despite suffering from unemployment in the textile mills, opposed slavery with a moral fervor that made it politically impossible for the government to support the Confederacy. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, framing the war as a struggle against slavery, British intervention became unthinkable. The government chose money and morality over geopolitical mischief. By the 1870s, the window for British reconquest had closed permanently. Not because Britain had lost the military capacity, but because the United States had grown too large, too populous, and too economically valuable to attack. The transcontinental railroad had been depleted, linking the Atlantic to the Pacific. American industrial output was beginning to rival Britain's. The population of the United States had surpassed that of Britain itself. The calculus had fundamentally shifted. America was no longer a breakaway colony. It was becoming a pure competitor. And here's the crucial part. Britain had spent the 19th century building and maintaining the largest empire in history. But empires are not monuments to national pride. They are businesses. Every colony, every protectorate, every sphere of influence had to justify its existence on the balance sheet. India was profitable because of its population, its resources, and its strategic position. Canada was valuable for its timber, furs, and proximity to American markets. Australia provided wool and a convenient dumping ground for convicts. But the United States was more valuable as an independent nation that traded freely than as a rebellious colony that would have to be occupied by force. This is the dirty secret of the British Empire that doesn't get taught in schools. The empire was never about spreading civilization or flying the flag for glory. It was about return on investment. And by the late 19th century, British investment in the United States was enormous. British capital financed American railroads, American mines, American steel mills. By 1914, Britain had more money invested in the United States than in any other country on earth. Why would Britain attack a nation that was paying it dividends? The final nail in the coffin of any reconquest fantasy came with the rise of Germany. By the 1890s, the German Empire had emerged as Britain's primary strategic rival. The German Navy was expanding. German industry was challenging British dominance in Europe. The geopolitical chessboard had shifted. Britain needed allies, not more enemies. The United States, with its growing navy and industrial capacity, was too valuable as a potential partner to alienate. The rapprochement between Britain and America at the turn of the 20th century wasn't born from shared values or cultural affinity. It was born from shared interests in containing German power. By the time World War I began in 1914, the idea of Britain reconquering America was not just impractical, it was absurd. Britain needed American loans, American munitions, and eventually American soldiers to defeat Germany. The relationship had inverted. Britain, the former imperial master, was now dependent on the financial and industrial might of its former colony. The empire that had ruled the waves was borrowing money from the republic it had lost. And then came World War II and the final chapter of British global dominance. As we've seen in earlier stories, Britain entered that war as a great power and emerged as a deterrent nation. The Americans didn't conquer Britain with armies. They bought it with loans and lend-lease agreements. They dismantled the imperial preference system. They took over British naval bases. They absorbed British markets in Latin America and Asia. By 1945, the question wasn't whether Britain would ever retake America. The question was whether Britain could maintain its independence from American economic domination. The story of why Britain never tried to reconquer the United States is the story of the evolution of power itself. In the 18th century, power meant territory. Empires measured their strength in square miles of land controlled. But by the 19th century, the smart imperialists realized that power meant capital. It meant trade flows and investment returns. Formal control was expensive and inefficient. Informal control, economy influence without political responsibility was the future. Britain never retook America because it never needed to. The informal empire of finance and trade gave Britain everything it wanted from the United States without the cost of occupation. And when American power eventually eclipsed British power, the transition was peaceful because the economic interests were so deeply intertwined that war between them became unthinkable. This is the real lesson of the Anglo-American relationship. Empires don't fall because they lose wars. They fall because they become economically obsolete. Britain lost its empire not on the battlefields of World War II, but in the ledgers of the Treasury, in the balance of payments crises of the 1940s, in the slow realization that the costs of empire exceeded the benefits. And the United States inherited that empire not by conquest, but by becoming the indispensable creditor, the indispensable market, the indispensable power. So when Admiral Cochrane sailed away from the burning American capital in 1814, he wasn't retreating in defeat. He was executing a strategic withdrawal based on economic calculation. Britain had made its point. It had demonstrated its power and now it would make its profit. The Americans could have their independence. Britain would have their money. That calculation made in the aftermath of a humiliating military raid set the template for the next 2 centuries of Anglo-American relations. It established the principle that in the modern world, economic interdependence is a stronger bond than political control. It proved that you don't need to rule a nation to dominate it. You just need to own its debt and control its markets. The British never retook America because they never lost it in the way that mattered. They lost the flag and the territory, but they kept the profits. At least until the Americans learned the same game and played it better than their former masters ever did.